Imagine a deal so corrupt, so dripping in greed, that entire governments pretended it never happened. Picture smoke-filled rooms, secret telegrams, and handshakes over polished mahogany tables. All while ordinary people struggled to afford the very fuel that kept their lives running. This wasn't a petty crime. This was a betrayal that oozed from the highest offices of power, one that shaped wars, collapsed economies, and rewrote maps. And the most disturbing part, it's barely a footnote in your history books. Today, we're peeling back the dusty pages to reveal an oil scandal they tried to erase from history. It began quietly, the way storms often do, not with thunder, but with a subtle shift in the air, a tension you can't quite name until it's too late. The world was changing. Machines had started to crawl across the earth in numbers no one could have imagined a generation before. Iron beasts that devoured fuel and spat out progress. Cities pulsed with the hum of engines. The oceans groaned under the weight of steel warships. Skies that had once been ruled only by birds now trembled beneath the roar of propellers. And behind all of it was a single, intoxicating substance, thick, black, and shimmering with promise. Coal had ruled for centuries, but coal was stubborn. It was heavy, dirty, limited. This new fuel was faster, cleaner to burn, easier to transport. It could slip into pipes and tanks, flow wherever it was needed, and give life to machines with a ferocity coal could never match. Those who understood this saw the future like a glimmering mirage, and they realized that whoever held this liquid gold wouldn't just have wealth, they would have control over the world itself. The hunger for it grew almost overnight. Countries looked at maps differently now, not as borders and territories, but as treasure maps where every marked reserve was a fortune waiting to be claimed. Ships no longer worried about running out of wind. Their only concern was whether they had enough of this precious fuel to keep their engines pounding through the waves. Armies began to measure their strength not only in soldiers and guns, but in barrels and storage tanks. Industry thrived, and with every new engine, every new factory, the addiction deepened. It was a hunger that didn't care about the cost. Towns were carved apart to make way for drilling rigs. Fields were turned into pumping stations. The land itself seemed to shudder under the relentless march of machinery. In the distance, the horizon would glow faintly at night, the silhouettes of derricks swaying against the moonlit sky like skeletal sentinels. Those who worked them said the smell never left your clothes, a sharp, oily temps that clung to skin, to hair, to memory. Governments began to whisper among themselves, not in the open halls of diplomacy, but in corridors where the light was thin and the walls were close. The fuel was no longer just a commodity, it was a weapon. It could keep a fleet moving across an ocean without pause. It could power a factory into overproduction while an enemy's machines rusted silent. Whoever had enough of it could choose when wars were fought, and more importantly, who won them. That kind of power attracted people who had little interest in the public good, out of sight from the public. There were reserves, enormous pools of this black lifeblood hidden beneath guarded land. They weren't meant for profit. They were a safeguard, a promise for the nation's survival if the worst ever came. These reserves were the kind of secret you could measure in millions of barrels, the kind of insurance policy that only the highest-ranking officials even knew existed. But secrets have a way of drawing out the wrong kind of attention. The world outside might have been caught up in the optimism of progress, but behind the smiles and patriotic speeches, there were eyes fixed on those reserves. Not the eyes of engineers or visionaries, but of opportunists. They could already hear the metallic hiss of valves turning, the steady gurgle of oil flowing into private storage, the clink of coins that would follow. And the more they thought about it, the more it became impossible to ignore the streets. In the capital still bustled with ordinary life, merchants calling out prices, children darting between market stalls, soldiers marching in neat formation, but in the upper floors of certain buildings, the conversations were different. They were slow and deliberate, the words chosen carefully, the voices low. Men who spoke in these rooms didn't deal in the currency of the common world. They dealt in influence, favors, promises. And they knew that with the right arrangement, those hidden reserves could change hands without a single shot being fired outside. The public had no reason to suspect anything. They were too busy marveling at the miracles this new energy was providing. Lights stayed on longer than ever before. Factories produced goods at dizzying speeds. The hum of engines filled the air like a new kind of music. Progress was addictive, and no one wanted to question what it might cost them later. But somewhere, beneath the surface of all this optimism, a shadow was spreading. Slow, patient, inevitable. The men who wanted those reserves knew better than to act too quickly. This wasn't something that could be rushed. The moves had to be quiet, almost invisible. One wrong step and the entire thing would collapse into scandal. So they began with handshakes, meetings over drinks in smoke-filled rooms, papers passed from one hand to another with barely a glance. The deals weren't written in ink so much as they were carved into silence, a silence bought and paid for with promises that could make anyone look the other way. The air in those rooms was heavy, the kind of thick stillness that made every sound feel too loud, the ticking of a clock, the scrape of a chair, the faint jingle of coins in a pocket. Each conversation moved in circles, never directly naming the thing they wanted, but circling it closer and closer until everyone understood without it ever being said. And when the final agreement was reached, it was done without fanfare. No speeches, no announcements, just a nod, and the quiet certainty that the wheels had been set in motion. Somewhere, far away, those massive reserves lay untouched under layers of rock and soil, their presence betrayed only by the occasional survey, marker or guarded fence. They waited in the dark, as they had for centuries, while above them, the game of ownership was already being decided. The players were patient. They knew that when the time came to take what they wanted, it wouldn't be a public act. There would be no marching armies, no roaring engines, just a quiet, almost imperceptible shift, and the black gold would flow into the hands of those who had been planning it all along. It was the calm before the storm. The streets were still busy, the machines still loud, the newspapers still filled with stories of prosperity. But somewhere in that hum of daily life, there was an undercurrent, a faint, almost inaudible rhythm of greed and ambition, the kind of rhythm that grows stronger the closer it gets to its prize. And when it finally broke the surface, when the shadow became impossible to ignore, it wouldn't just be a theft. It would be a betrayal so deep that it would stain the very foundations it was built on. And yet, for now, the world kept turning, blissfully unaware that its lifeblood was already being marked, claimed, and prepared for the taking. It started the way most betrayals do, quietly, almost politely. Like a hand resting gently on your shoulder before it tightens just enough to let you know it will never let go. On the surface, the city carried on as it always had. Street cars rattled past shop windows. Newspapers shouted headlines about faraway conflicts and record harvests. In the grand halls of government, speeches echoed with promises of stability and honor. But somewhere behind those walls, in corners where sunlight rarely touched, a different kind of conversation was taking place. It began with a question whispered between two men who both understood they were no longer speaking as public servants or businessmen, but as conspirators. There was no mention of the reserves directly, no bold declaration of intent. The language was careful, almost ceremonial, as if every word had been weighed for how it might sound if repeated later. And yet, behind the measured tone, the meaning was unmistakable. The hidden oil, the black lifeblood meant to be untouchable, it could be theirs. The first meetings were in respectable places, as if respectability might disguise what was really happening. Hotel lounges with crystal glasses that caught the light just so. Dining rooms where silver cutlery slid across porcelain plates. But as the talks deepened, the venues grew darker. Shuttered offices after hours. Private clubs where their curtains were always drawn. Rooms that smelled faintly of cigars, leather, and the damp weight of secrecy. Here, in this dimly lit world, the rules of public trust no longer apply. The people making these decisions were not thinking about service or law or even reputation. They were thinking about opportunity, the kind that only comes once in a lifetime, the kind that could turn a man from powerful to untouchable. The process was deceptively simple. The reserves, enormous and guarded, could not be sold outright without raising suspicion, but they could be leased temporarily, discreetly, and with the right arrangement, those leases could slip through without competitive bidding, without public knowledge, without a single headline until it was far too late. All it would take was a signature, one name on a document, tucked away in an office no one would think to search, and the nation's emergency lifeblood would quietly begin flowing into private pipelines. The bribes did not come in the crude form of sacks of coins or crude threats. No, this was subtler, more elegant. There were loans that did not require repayment, land deeds passed as gifts, bonds worth small fortunes, tucked into envelopes and handed over without a word. Cash, yes, but always delivered in ways that could be explained if someone happened to notice. A payment for services, a settlement of debts, and once there was a suitcase heavy enough to make its carrier's arm ache, yet light enough to be carried into a room without drawing attention. It was placed beside a desk, unlatched just long enough for both men to see what lay inside, then closed again with a soft "Disiji bukuriku." Every transaction was wrapped in the illusion of legitimacy. Contracts were drafted, but never discussed. Publicly, agreements were sealed, but never celebrated. The secrecy was part of the thrill, and also the shield. The fewer people who knew, the easier it would be to deny everything later. Still, secrecy is never perfect. A deal this large creates ripples. A clock notices documents that aren't where they should be. A driver wonders why his employer is meeting with certain men late at night. A banker raises an eyebrow at a sudden transfer, but in those days, suspicion alone was not enough to spark outrage. Those who notice learned quickly to keep their questions to themselves. The men at the center of this web moved with a confidence that came from knowing they were shielded by their positions. They spoke as if the reserves already belonged to them, as if the legal barriers that stood in the way were little more than inconveniences waiting to be brushed aside. They had built careers on the belief that rules were flexible, and they applied that belief here with surgical precision. In the dim rooms where these decisions were made, time seemed to move differently. The outside world might be rushing forward, the streets alive with traffic, the factories churning out goods, the newspapers chasing the next sensation. But inside, the air was heavy and still. A clock might tick, slow and deliberate. A match might flare as a cigar was lit. Voices stayed low, their rhythm unbroken even when speaking of sums so vast they could have rebuilt entire towns. There was a strange intimacy to these meetings. The men involved spoke to each other with the ease of co-conspirators, bonded not by friendship, but by the shared understanding that they were crossing a line together. Trust was not given, only implied, the kind of trust that comes from knowing both parties have too much to lose if the other speaks. And so, one by one, the pieces fell into place. Papers were signed, approvals were filed quietly, their significance buried under a flood of routine bureaucratic decisions. Somewhere in the official records, the leases existed, but they were camouflaged by language so dull and technical that no casual reader would recognize them for what they were. When it was done, there was no announcement, no headlines, no cheers. The only sound was the soft rustle of documents being locked away, the faint clink of glasses as the men toasted not to victory, but to survival. Because that was the true skill of such a theft, not in taking the prize, but in ensuring that no one realized it was gone. The reserves themselves, buried deep and silent, knew nothing of the hands that now claimed them. They had waited for centuries, untouched and unspoiled, their value immeasurable in the right moment. Now, without fanfare, they belonged to men who would drain them not in the nation's hour of need, but for profit, for power, for the satisfaction of knowing they had taken what was meant for everyone and made it their own. Outside, life went on. Children laughed in the streets. Engines roared in the distance. Newspapers carried stories of prosperity and peace, and somewhere beneath that fragile illusion, a pipeline had already been tapped. A valve had already been opened. The black gold was flowing, and with it, the quiet, certain knowledge that the theft was complete. It would be months before the first whispers began to circulate. Years before anyone understood the scale of what had been done. And even then, the truth would emerge like something dragged from the deep, warped, half buried, difficult to believe. But for now, in those dim rooms and locked offices, the conspirators could breathe easily. The deal was sealed, and the shadows had done their job well. It began, as most collapses do, with a sound so small it could be ignored. Not the crash of a door being kicked in, not the blare of trumpets announcing ruin, just a murmur. carried in the wrong hallway at the wrong time, a passing comment in a bar, a question asked twice in the same week by two different people who shouldn't have known each other. At first, it was nothing. The men behind a deal had prepared for suspicion, had told themselves that even if someone caught the faintest scent of their work, the trail would be too faint to follow. But whispers are alive. They grow. They find ears eager to listen. And soon, they slip under doors, through cracks in walls, until they are everywhere at once. It was the smallest detail that made the first crack. A clerk noticed an authorization that didn't match any previous process, filed under a category it didn't belong in. An oil field worker heard from a friend that drilling was starting in a place no one was supposed to touch. A junior accountant saw a transfer so large it made his fingers pause over the ledger alone. These things were harmless. Together, they began to take shape like a shadow moving just outside the edge of vision. The city still pulsed with its usual rhythm. Carriages and cars rattled down the streets. Vendors shouted over the hum of engines. Radios spilled music into warm kitchens. But underneath it all, there was a quiet change in the air, a thickness that made people lower their voices when certain subjects came up. In the offices where deals had been signed months before, laughter came less easy. The men involved now carried themselves differently, more watchful, more debated, as though every handshake was an evaluation, every conversation a possible test. The first questions came from small-town newspapers, the kind no one in the capital took seriously. A few paragraphs buried under livestock prices and wedding announcements, asking why reserves meant for national security were suddenly producing oil. The officials ignored them. A few local editors were pressured, reminded of favors owed, coaxed into dropping the matter. But the questions didn't die. They moved. They found a reporter with a taste for trouble and the patience to dig. This reporter didn't shout his suspicions. He gathered them like a hunter setting traps, carefully, methodically. He spoke to dock workers who loaded barrels into unmarked trucks. He shared cigarettes with surveyors who let slip that certain land was suddenly off limits to the public. He leaned close when a drilling foreman, after his third drink, muttered something about friends in high places and money changing hands faster than oil. And then came the moment when whispers became something else entirely. A single article printed in black ink that smelled faintly of the press room, laid out just enough to catch attention. It didn't accuse outright. It didn't need to. It asked questions in a way that made readers feel like they already knew the answers. By the time the paper reached the capital, copies were already folding and unfolding in hands that mattered. The powerful tried to smother it. They called it political theater, a smear campaign, a fabrication by jealous rivals. But every denial only seemed to make the rumor more solid, as if pushing against it gave it weight. More reporters joined the chase, more ledgers were examined, more workers questioned. Each new scrap of evidence was like a drop of ink in clear water. The stain spread, slow but unstoppable. Behind closed doors, the mood shifted from confidence to calculation. The men at the center of it all began to avoid certain places, cancel certain dinners. They burned letters, shredded documents, replaced loyal clerks with ones they could control, but you can only hide so much for so long. The questions were now being asked in places that could not be silenced, in the chambers where laws were made, in the hearing rooms with walls that echoed every word. The hearings began without ceremony. A long table, heavy chairs, a pitcher of water sweating onto the wood. The men called to speak tried to maintain the calm they had perfected in quieter rooms, but here the air was different. There were no shadows to hide in, no way to control. Who listened? The questions came slow at first, then sharper, like the point of a knife testing for weak spots. They were asked about meetings, about leases, about why certain contracts existed at all, and then, inevitably, about the money. Numbers began to surface, too precise to be coincidence, too large to be ignored. Loans with no repayment, payments with no clear purpose, suitcases passed from hand to hand under the glow of electric lamps. The story that had once been scattered in fragments now sat on the table in one dark, undeniable shape. The public, once distant from the matter, began to lean closer. Editorials dripped with outrage. Crowds gathered outside government buildings, their breath misting in the cold air, waiting to see which men would emerge looking smaller than they had gone in. The scandal had slipped its leash. It was no longer a thing that could be bargained with or bribed away. It had a momentum of its own now, rolling downhill, pulling everything in its path along with it. In the quiet of their private rooms, the men who had once been so certain now found themselves listening for footsteps in the hall, for the sound of someone knocking with news they didn't want to hear. Sleep came harder. Meals sat untouched. They spoke less, and when they did, it was in short, clipped sentences, as if too many words might invite more trouble. And yet, the truth still wasn't fully out. There was more, always more documents hidden in desk drawers, letters tucked in coat linings, accounts held under false names. The hunt for them had begun, and with every passing day, the net drew tighter. The whispers had grown teeth. What had started as a murmur in the dark had swelled into a roar, and it was no longer asking politely for answers. The city no longer felt the same. The air was sharp, the streets somehow colder. People glanced over their shoulders more often, wary of being overheard. In every conversation, there was an awareness that the ground was shifting, that something was about to break. The men in power could feel it too. That hollow drop in the stomach when you realize the storm you thought you'd outrun has been behind you the entire time, and somewhere in an office lit by a single swinging bulb, a reporter sat at his desk, his typewriter clicking like a slow heartbeat. He had the next piece, the one that would not just suggest, but prove. He could feel it. The point of no return was coming. Soon, the world would know. And when it did, there would be no going back. It broke like glass. One day, the whispers still had space to hide between denial and doubt, and the next, the entire facade leaving jagged edges for everyone to see. The truth had been creeping in for months, moving quietly through hallways and folded newspaper pages, but now it arrived all at once, unstoppable. It was no longer rumor, no longer suggestion, it was fact, cold and hard as stone, laid bare for the world to judge. The morning it hit the city felt different. The air was sharp, as if holding its breath. Newspapers disappeared from stands within minutes, their front pages screaming in black letters that couldn't be taken back. People read them in the streets, in trams, at lunch counters, heads bent, close to the paper as though trying to absorb every word. Names that once carried weight and respect now dripped with scandal. Dates, amounts, locations, each detail like a hammer blow. There was no clever phrasing to soften it, no polite language to dull the edge. It was theft, plain and vast, measured not in coins, but in entire rivers of oil. Stolen from the nation's own lifeblood dot in the marble buildings, where the guilty once walked with steady steps. The atmosphere curdled. Secretaries moved quickly, their eyes lowered. Doors that had always been open now stayed shut. Men who once commanded rooms now sat hunched at long tables, the weight of the accusations pressing down on their shoulders. The hearings had shifted. Tone, no longer cautious, no longer exploratory. Now the questions were sharp, and they cut deep. Each answer was a stone dropped into water, sending ripples that reached places the speakers had hoped would never be touched. And the documents, they were everywhere now, not hidden in private drawers or guarded offices, but spread across tables for the public to see. Photographs of them appeared in the press, the neat typewriting, the official seals, the signatures that had once been hidden under layers of bureaucracy. There was no arguing with them. They told the story in black and white. The leases granted without competition, the transfers of money disguised as loans, the sudden appearance of luxury in the lives of men who claimed modest means. The crowds outside swelled. They came in the cold, stamping their feet for warmth, their breath visible in the air. Some shouted, some simply stood, their presence itself a statement. They waited for news of resignations, arrests, punishments. Inside, the men on the stand avoided their gaze, but they could feel it, that silent jury beyond the walls. Thousands strong, watching every move. One by one, the defenses crumbled. The denials sounded thinner each day, worn down by evidence that arrived in wave after wave. A witness would confirm a payment, and another would produce a letter. A ledger would appear, and beside it, a testimony that explained every figure in it. The case was no longer something that needed to be built. It was already standing, and its shadow fell over everything. The turning point came when the first of them broke, sitting under the glare of the hearing room lights, with the smell of stale paper and sweat hanging in the air. He stopped pretending. His voice was low, steady, as he laid out the sequence of events, who met with whom, where the deals were struck, how the money moved. He spoke without drama, but every word landed with the weight of a confession carved in stone. By the time he finished, the room was silent. The kind of silence that swallows sound and seems to press against your skin. From there, the fall was swift. Indictments were filed. Arrests were made. The man at the center of it all, the one whose signature had set the entire theft in motion, was led away. His once proud posture broken, his eyes fixed on the floor. History would remember him for this moment. The first of his kind, too. Face prison not for an act of war or treason, but for greed. The oil stopped flowing to the private pipelines. Control was seized back by the state, though the damage had already been done. The reserves that had been meant to safeguard the nation were diminished, siphoned away for profit. The betrayal left a wound that could not be measured only in barrels or dollars. It was a fracture of trust, a proof that those entrusted with the public's lifeline had been willing to sell it for their own gain. In the weeks that followed, the story stayed on the front pages, each new headline another twist. Of the knife, editorials called for reforms. Politicians, eager to distance themselves, condemned the very system they had quietly benefited from. And the public, the ones who had never been invited into the rooms where it happened, watched with a mix of anger and wary recognition. This was not the first time they had been deceived, and it would not be the last. The guilty tried to salvage what they could. Some retreated into silence, refusing all interviews. Others wrote long self-serving statements claiming they had acted in the nation's best interest, but their words fell flat. The scandal had burned away the illusions, leaving only the raw truth, power, when unchecked. Will take what it wants and tell you it was for your own good by the end of it. The buildings where the deals had been made felt different. The hall seemed colder. The light through the high windows fell at sharper angles, as though revealing dust that had always been there but gone unnoticed. People walked faster through them now, eyes forward, eager to be somewhere else. And yet, in the quiet, there was an unsettling realization. For all the outrage, for all the trials and sentences, the wealth taken from those reserves was gone forever. The men might face punishment, their reputations might be destroyed, but the oil, that black, irreplaceable lifeblood, had already been burned, sold, transformed into fortunes scattered beyond reach. What had been stolen was more than a resource. It was security, leverage, a future that could no longer be reclaimed. The scandal had broken wide open. Yes, it had shattered careers and filled prisons, but the true costs lingered in the air, like the faint, acrid scent of oil that refuses to fade even after the barrels are gone. And somewhere in that scent was the knowledge that what happened here could happen again. All it would take was a little time, a little shadow, and the right hands waiting in the dark. It begins not with a violent crash, but with a silence so complete it feels unnatural, and absence where noise should be, a void where outrage once lived. The storm has passed, but what follows is not peace. It is something far more dangerous. The air carries a strange stillness, heavy with the residue of secrets. The scandal, once a raging inferno, now smolders in hushed corners, not because the truth has been settled, but because hands in the dark have been busy sweeping away the ashes. It happens slowly, deliberately. Documents vanish not in dramatic raids or public bonfires, but in quiet rooms where the sound of tearing paper is swallowed by the hum of a lone electric light. Records are misplaced, filed in the wrong cabinets, or sent to archives that no one will ever access. Reports are redacted until they are nothing but black rectangles blotting out the names, the dates, the trails that once led to the heart of the corruption. Even the language changes. What was once called betrayal becomes administrative. Oversight, what was once theft, becomes misallocation of resources. Words are rearranged until the sharp edges are gone. The past is being rewritten in real time, each edit erasing another piece of the crime. Those who remember start to feel like they're going mad. Conversations turn awkward when the subject comes up. People glance over their shoulders, lower their voices or pretend not to understand what's being discussed. Eyes dart away, as if the very act of remembering is dangerous. The roar of public outrage has dwindled to a faint murmur, and even that is fading. Something has shifted in invisible but palpable force, pressing down, warning everyone to let it go. The ones who orchestrated it move with an almost supernatural calm. They know the playbook by heart. First, stall the investigations until the public grows restless and distracted. Then, flood the news with fresher controversies, brighter distractions, and stories that are easier to talk about. Memory is a fragile thing. It doesn't need to be destroyed all at once. It only needs to be starved until it withers. And so, the old story is buried under the weight of new headlines. People talk about other scandals, other crises, other dangers. The past becomes a blur, a ghost no one can fully recall. The photographs that once served as proof are locked away in private collections, or conveniently lost in floods and fires that strike at just the right time. Witnesses are quietly discredited not with outright threats, but with subtle whispers that they are unstable, unreliable, or motivated by greed. One by one, their voices vanish from the conversation. There is no single dramatic moment when the truth dies, no final scene where the last shred of evidence is burned. Instead, it fades like an old film reel left too long in the sun. The colors drain, the details blur, and before long, even those who lived through it begin to doubt what they saw. It becomes a story with no clear beginning or end. A rumor that might have been exaggerated, a scandal that some claim never really happened. Years pass. The players grow older, retire, or die. The buildings where the deals were struck are renovated, repainted, repurposed. The corridors that once echoed with whispered conspiracies now hum with the footsteps of people who have no idea what took place there. The land itself seems to conspire with the forgetting. Dust settles on the ground where history bled, weeds push through the cracks, and time wraps everything in a soft, deceptive stillness. But somewhere in the deep recesses of forgotten filing cabinets, in attics filled with yellowing papers, in the fading memories of those who cannot let go, fragments survive. A receipt, a photograph, a half-erased name in a ledger, they are the stubborn remnants, too small to change the narrative but too real to fully disappear. They whisper that the past is not gone, only buried, waiting for the right hands to dig it up. That the tragedy is not only what was done, but how easily it was erased. How a moment that once threatened to change everything became just another chapter in the long, unbroken cycle of corruption and forgetting. History, after all, has a short attention span, especially when it is taught what to remember and what to forget. And so the story remains in the shadows, not because it is unknown, but because it is inconvenient. In the quiet that follows, the silence feels almost triumphant. It is the kind of silence that has been bought and secured, a silence that protects the powerful and suffocates the truth. And though the world keeps moving, there is a lingering chill for those who still recall the details, a cold understanding that justice was not denied in a single blow, but smothered slowly, carefully, until it could no longer breathe. the amnesia, is complete, but it is not natural. It is crafted, polished, and reinforced until the lie becomes easier to believe than the truth. What remains is not a clean slate, but a scar hidden beneath fresh paint. A reminder for anyone who dares to look closely that some wounds are never healed. They are simply hidden, waiting for time or fate to strip away the cover. And when that happens, the silence will not be enough to contain what comes crawling back into the light.